Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session on biodiversity in urban landscapes in collaboration with the Jordan Green Building Council. My name is Lana Abu Qalbain, and I'm a technical engineer at the Emirates Green Building Council. As many of you may know, the Emirates Green Building Council was created with the aim of raising awareness and promoting sustainability of the built environment. And since its beginning in 2006, we have come a long way, and I'm sure there is a lot more to do. With that being said, I'll hand over to Mr. Raji Hattar to do a quick opening that will shed light on today's session. Mr. Raji, I wanted to introduce you a little more. He is the chair of the MENA Regional Network of Green Building Councils. So, tfaddal.
Thank you, Lana, and it's my honor to welcome all of you today to this webinar. This webinar marks a significant step forward in Emirates Green Building Council regional outreach and in our collective efforts to promote sustainable development across the MENA region. And when I say our, all green building councils in the region. Today's discussion, which is the Building Harmony, Conserving Biodiversity in Urban Landscapes of Emirates and Jordan, is particularly coming on time and is relevant. And we are discussing a few things that are related to climate change nowadays and the impact us humans are having on the biodiversity around us. So we are here to delve into the intricate relationship between our built environment and the precious biodiversity that surrounds us in both Emirates and Jordan. And as all of you know, biodiversity is the foundation of life on Earth, supporting ecosystems, providing essential services, and enriching our quality of life in ways both tangible and intangible. Yet the rapid pace of urbanization and unchecked development poses a grave threat to the invaluable resources. Our cities are expanding, and you can tell every year each city, some of the cities are expanding by 2 to 5, 10% sometimes. Habitats are being fragmented, especially the forests, the areas where the species are living. And species are facing unprecedented challenges to their survival. We see lots of the species that we used to see before as extinct, and we cannot see them anymore. However, amidst these changes lies opportunities. The built environment, often seen as a culprit in the loss of biodiversity, can also be a powerful agent for positive change. Through innovative design, sustainable practices, and responsible urban planning, we have the ability to not only mitigate the negative impact of development, but also enhance biodiversity and create thriving, resilient communities. With that being said, I invite all of you to enjoy a very informative session involving experts from both countries, and I would like to welcome our distinguished speakers and thank them for the efforts they are going to put. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Raji. So as Mr. Raji has mentioned, we'll be talking about biodiversity in relation to the built environment and honestly, some food for thought, which we've been impacted by in a way or another. The recent floods in the UAE, even though they occurred here in the UAE, other countries in the world were impacted by different ways of climatic issues, such as floods in Indonesia or France. And one way of responding to these climatic changes or severe weather conditions is through creating cities that will have blue and green sponges. And these sponges will eventually have biodiversity integrated within. So at the same time, biodiversity is really related to the built environment. And today with the expert speakers, we'll know more about what is biodiversity, why is it important, how can we advance it. And the lineup of speakers we have for today from Jordan, we have Mr. Mohammed Asfour, who's the founding chair of Jordan Green Building Council and founding and current chair at Wadi. We have Mr. Tariq Qanir, projects manager and conservation specialist at the Royal Society for of Nature. And from the UAE, we have, who's joining shortly, Alicia Daoud, the senior associate environmental consultant water in AESG. And we have Mr. Peter Farrington, principal environmental specialist Nature Reserve Section, Environmental Sustainability Department. And we have Yusuf Abbas, Senior Specialist Sustainability, Engineering and Technical Services, AD Ports Group. So welcome to all of you and thank you for your time. We'll start off with Peter Farrington by setting the scene. So with your extensive experience across different countries, like what we're telling, for example, in Oman, Canada, Qatar, and Dubai, could you share with us how is biodiversity responding to challenges posed by climate change? And why is preserving biodiversity crucial for sustainable development in regions like the UAE?
Well, thank you, Lana, and good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. And thank you to the Green Building Councils of the UAE and Jordan for inviting me to your event in celebration of World Migratory Birds Day. So very happy to be here. I thought I would answer your question by first getting a little bit more into what biodiversity is, what it means. And for me, it's equivalent to nature. So in a very general sense, more scientifically, one can view it as a variety of life, usually defined at the genetic, species, and ecosystems level. And there's questions, does it include viruses? Because viruses technically can't procreate on their own. They need a host in order to do that, and therefore, some ways considered not to be a life form. But I include that as part of biodiversity because greater than 40% of human characteristics, actually, that we all possess are attributable to viruses. So then the question is, okay, so at a species level, how many species actually are there on the planet? We don't know. One estimate says that there's 2.13 million species that science has identified on the planet of the 8.7 million species that are actually out there. Other estimates are that 2.13 million actually is equivalent to just the insect species in the soils alone. Another one says there's 430 million species of microorganisms. So we really don't know at the species level, and therefore at the ecosystems and genetic level, just how biodiverse this planet actually is. And another thing I thought important to mention, that humans are part of nature. We're not apart from nature. For example, of our 30 to 40 trillion cells, which make up a human being, 90% of them are microbes. They're bacteria. They're not even human cells. So we are biodiverse ourselves, actually. So whatever happens to biodiversity impacts us. So that's a little bit on biodiversity, just sort of a basis there in terms of what is climate change. So this is another complex topic. It's difficult to be precise. There's only about 10 supercomputers in the world that can actually do the calculations to produce the models and forecasting about what's happening on this planet. It's so complicated. It's so much data is required. But essentially what we're talking about is the accelerated shift above long-term norms in temperature, hotter, longer summers, for example, and precipitation, which is more variable. Some places get less moisture, some places get more, and we end up with storm events like what you mentioned, Lana, in terms of the recent flooding and storms in UAE, happened in Brazil, elsewhere. So all of this contributes to sea level rise, ocean acidity, change in currents, warmer seas, forests, grass fires, flooding, disease outbreaks, water scarcity. So the question is, how do biodiversity respond to all these changes? Well, to a large extent, biodiversity, which includes us, are adapted to respond. Sometimes it's at a genetic level where we have some parts of a population are able to respond very well because they're genetically predisposed to being able to adapt to those sort of situations. So the response of biodiversity depends upon the circumstances. There's no concern that the Earth will fail from a biodiversity perspective. And just to give you an example there is more biomass in what's called the subterranean archipelago than and that's 5 kilometers deep into the planet, than all the human beings put together by hundreds of times. So the Earth itself, one can consider to be a living organism. So how does biodiversity respond to climate change? Well, it's difficult to be precise on this as well, because we're not dealing just with changes in climate. We're also dealing with the other stressors like pollution, agriculture, which is one of the major contributors towards climate change, urban encroachment, as has been mentioned before. We have exotic species now in urban environments with a lot of use of pesticides, synthetic fertilizers, there's noise, And as has been mentioned in the introduction, loss or degradation of habitat. We have shipping, which includes a lot of invasive species. So we have a lot of stressors on the planet. And I'm just going to summarize very quickly how we're responding, how biodiversity is responding. So in 2018, the World Wildlife Fund estimated that in the last 50 years, there's been a 60% decline in the population of birds, mammals, reptiles, fish, amphibians worldwide. So what we're seeing is the response of nature to the things that are happening on this planet, climate change being one of them, has been seen a dramatic decline in population. So there's a lot of wildlife that's at risk. We also see changes in distribution in wildlife. So in arid places like UAE, very hyper-arid, very hot, a lot of animals and plants are at the edges of their ranges. So a slight shift in their environment can mean they disappear, simply because they're at the edges of their ranges. So this is what we can expect. And we're starting to see some examples of some species either declining in population or disappearing entirely from this region. So we have concerns in this regard. However, on the flip side, it creates conditions that are more amenable to other species as well. So unfortunately, some of those may be mosquitoes, which we were talking about before the broadcast start, because a little bit of rain on top of the climate means it's more acceptable and more amenable for those plants or insects. Final point, just in terms of biodiversity and how ecosystems are responding and the opportunities that it creates, is that there are coral species, for example, that are extremely well adapted to the life in hotter, warmer waters and conditions that you find here normally that other parts of the world are going to experience or may experience in the near future. So we actually have a technology in the corals here that might be useful for regeneration or establishment of corals that are impacted in other parts of the world. So the species here might be actually quite suitable for other parts of the world. So that's how it's responding. Why is, hopefully I'm not going to use up too much of my time here, Elena. So why is preserving biodiversity crucial? Well, again, as the opening remark said, we are biodiversity as well. So by preserving biodiversity, we're also preserving ourselves. Sustainable development, I mean, that's a term that's used a lot too. It's about producing and consuming locally in ways which do not harm nature locally and globally, now and in the future. And that's difficult to do because I've already said how complicated nature is. But why is it so important? Well, 40% of our nature, of our medicines, still come from biodiversity, not synthetically, but from nature. There's a direct, positive, and scientifically proven link between health and happiness of people and their connection with nature. And I think in Green Building Council, you're probably quite familiar with the term biophilia. A lot of cities and buildings are being designed with this in mind. It's, of course, a source of our food. Economies like tourism require biodiversity. It's, as was mentioned again, it's the foundation of the very existence of humanity. It's biodiversity. So cities are the greatest challenge for maintaining the connection to nature. If we want to be happy, if we want to have the food security, humans living in cities need to have that connection with nature. And this is, I think, the challenge. And there are many opportunities that we can look forward to if we start to plan and design our cities properly.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, you were able to sum it up in such little time, and I feel there's so much still to talk about, and it's such a complex issue for us to understand really what's going on. But I feel it's really an exciting one. Inshallah, we find answers here and there, and we're on the path together. So moving on to Tariq. If you can please provide an overview of the Royal Society for Conservation of Nature, and additionally, if you can highlight the significance of biodiversity in Jordan, and why is it special and crucial? Tariq, are you able to hear us?
Just now heard you.
Okay, so
Because
I was
I missed the
asking.
connection.
No
Okay.
problem. I was asking if you can provide an overview of the Royal Society for Conservation of Nature and tell us more about the biodiversity in Jordan and its importance and significance, please.
Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this webinar to remark World Migratory Bird Day and to talk about the conservation activities in Jordan. Thank you very much. RSCN, or the Royal Society for the Conservation of Nature, is an independent national organization devoted by the government to the conservation of nature of Jordan's natural resources. RSCN was established in 1966 with His Majesty the late King Hussein as honorary president. RSCN has the mission of protecting and managing the natural resources of Jordan. Thus, it is one of the few national organizations in the Middle East with such a public service mandate. So managing the natural resources of Jordan is done by setting up protected areas to safeguard the best wildlife, and RSCN established and managing until now around 10 protected areas covering over around 1,600 square kilometers. These areas comprise of wild plants, animals, and other natural resources, while including some of the finest natural landscape in the country. In addition, RSCN is devoted by the government to enforcing the governmental law to protect wildlife, control illegal hunting, and raise awareness in the environmental issue through educational program. About the importance of Jordan and Jordan's biodiversity, as you know, Jordan is a relatively small area or small country with size around 89,000 square kilometers, but it is contains a unique and distinctive biodiversity. This is resulted from several factors, including the geographical location between 3 continents, in addition to wide range topographical feature, geological structure, and physical factors as precipitation and temperature. Jordan is divided into 4 by geographical region: the Mediterranean, Irano-Turanian, Saharo-Arabian, and Sudanian zone. Thus, the vegetation pattern is classified into 13 types, whereas each type is dominant by plant type. For example, Aleppo natural Aleppo pine forest in the north part of Jordan, in Dibin or in Jarash. Meanwhile, the country is distinguished by existing of 4 ecosystems globally importance, which are the Dead Sea, the Jordan River, the Gulf River, the Gulf of Aqaba, and the Dead Sea system. Each of them is characterized by a number of unique advantages. For example, the Dead Sea is the lowest point on the earth with about 420 meters below sea level. Also, it's considered one of the biogeographical important zones since it contains many flora and fauna species that are important globally. Also, Jordan environment is characterized by tremendous biodiversity level. Many ecological surveys have been conducted by research team at RSCN, which confirmed the existence of globally important components in terms of natural habitats and species of both flora and fauna. As you know, Jordan is located along major bird migration corridor, Rift Valley corridor, from Turkey to South Africa, and this is Jordan part of this corridor through the Jordan Rift Valley, named by Jordan Rift Valley. Bird migrating from Europe pass through Jordan in migrating season, spring and autumn, being a significantly rich country when it comes to bird. Jordan has around 400, also recorded in Jordan, around 430 bird species recorded in Jordan. More than 300 of these species are migrant species that pass through the country on their migration between Europe and Africa and vice versa. There is a spectacular spring migration of raptors through Jordan, heading for breeding ground in Europe, and possible involving more than 1 million birds, including significant proportion.
I think we lost Tariq. Unfortunately, you should be joining soon. But anyways, meanwhile, I'll just welcome Alicia. Welcome to our session. Thank you for joining. And
Thank you. Excuses for my apologies for my late tardiness.
It's fine. So we'll go on to your question. So now more onto the technical part on the built environment and focusing on what happens there. So drawing from your experience, what is sensitive biodiversity? And giving us examples from the UAE, how do you navigate the complexities of urban development, ensuring that this sensitive biodiversity is identified, protected, and integrated into projects efficiently?
Thank you. So I know Peter had a very interesting background and introduction already, and he is the expert in that field. But when we talk about sensitive biodiversity as an environmental consultant, it can become, a difficult thing to navigate because we are an expanding place. Our urban environments are encroaching on the natural environments. But what I think is important is that we have environmental impact assessments to sort of guide that process, which is also propped up by regulations that are set out to let us know what is protected and to ensure that if there are these critical habitats that are identified, how will we maintain that? How will we mitigate it? So an environmental impact assessment is sort of our first line. We're able to understand what the project's needed for, where it's going to be, and then we can identify that sensitive biodiversity within our project area. And then we can actually do our analysis on that, whether that's mapping, we'd obviously have to do some site surveys, we have to do historical data. So all that combined will give us a better understanding of that sensitive biodiversity and what that means. And then we're able to also say, within our environmental impact assessments, this is what has been set out in the legislation, and that really helps us to protect that sensitive biodiversity because that's what's been identified by the local agencies. So with that, it's enabling us to actually go out and say, okay, this is the sensitive habitat we found in this area. This is what we can do to mitigate it. These are the measures we can do. But also we're trying to consider this area also is going to be developed. So how can we make sure that we're incorporating these green spaces into that? How can we keep biodiversity and how can we use it as that gain for the built environment? So it's about finding that sort of that balance between having the best of both worlds, which can be a difficult task to do, I believe, because we're kind of competing with nature in a way when we should be working with nature a little bit better. So it's about coming up with, the monitoring and that adaptive management that we should have in place when we do these developments, instead of just removing that, sensitive biodiversity, how can we incorporate within it? How can we benefit each other? So I feel the environmental impact assessment is our first line of approach of how we're going to identify any sensitivities, and then we're able to understand how we can protect it, how we can design and work with it. So as we expand these areas, we're very cognizant of what's sensitive, what needs to be protected, how we're going to protect it, and those plans and management that can be in place to actually protect it. So this holistic approach is a combination between scientific research, it's by stakeholder engagement with the regulators, with the community, with the developers, and that way we can actually plan strategically how we're going to pull it off. We know that our urban sprawl is becoming bigger and bigger, but we want to see, better mitigation measures taken so we don't actually forever remove this biodiversity that we're so lucky to have here in the UAE.
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you for shedding light on the process that goes behind. Definitely what we see is a new project coming here or there, but there's so much intricacy going on behind to ensure that hopefully biodiversity will thrive or get integrated into the built environment. So this moves us to Jordan. With Mohammed Asfour, and I love that the participants from Jordan are shedding light more onto species and birds, celebrating the Bird Migratory Day. So I know that Mohammed, you want me to share some slides that will showcase images of birds that are, I guess, native or migrating through Jordan. But first, I'll ask you a question, and then we can go through the slides. So as someone deeply involved in sustainability projects across various sectors, with a great experience, what is the current status and major challenges faced in preserving the biodiversity of birds in particular in Jordan, and the biodiversity in general within the urban landscapes, particularly concerning the built environment? So I'll go ahead and share your presentation, and you can start.
Okay, so maybe before I start answering the question, maybe I should tell you that it is birds that got me interested in green buildings in the first place. Can you, good. And it all started when I was 9 years old, when I saw a flock of rose-ringed parakeets in our garden, the ones you can see in the image in front of you. Now, this was something unusual for a Mediterranean city that is 1,000 meters above sea level. And since then, I have been recording the birds I see all over. And believe it or not, it was the main reason behind my passion and involvement in funding environmental initiatives such as the Jordan GBC, the MENA Green Building Council Network, and later my role with the World GBC, which is something I continue doing through Wadi, whereby we propagated about over 2 million seedlings of native plants in the recent period. Now, as my colleagues mentioned, biodiversity and nature are life. And the stark reality is that we have lost that link with nature and with our roots as human beings, a link that reflects on our well-being. And as someone who has academically indulged into studying positive psychology, I can tell you that reconstructing that relationship between us and nature can help us become more grounded, more productive, and simply thrive. During my first presentation on green buildings back in 2008 or 2009, I used the following picture, please. Yes, it is of a bowerbird, where I demonstrated how wildlife too can build their own structures. This is an Australian bird. And in the following slides, I can share with you some of the photos of biodiversity that exists in my garden. This is a Palestine sunbird, and there were a few just flying by me while we were talking. The next one, please. This is a wryneck. The first one was a resident. This is a migratory bird. Next. We tend to forget how important bees are for biodiversity, and in many cases, laws and regulations prevent people from having bees in their own gardens, which is something that needs to change. Next. Now, before I go into that image, let's come back to answering your question. And what is it that we could do to bring back biodiversity into our cities? I think the first step is to recognize that there is a problem. We aren't giving the matter the attention it requires. The way we design our buildings and plan our cities really take biodiversity into account. And even when we plant trees, we don't really think of native species that could host native insects, birds, and animals. Second, we need to think of what is preventing wildlife from thriving in our cities. And for this, we need to come up with practical solutions that could include nature-based solutions, of course, to bring back biodiversity to Amman and to our cities in general. This, of course, will require the right laws and regulations we need to have in place. And let's not forget here the role of outreach and awareness, especially with children. And in this photo, I
would like to show you how we worked with school children many years ago in trying to build their awareness. And if you go to the next slide, make them appreciate trees and wildlife in general. That's it for my answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. These pictures were really heartwarming, honestly. So from there, we move on to Yusuf and mega projects. So given the large projects the AD Ports Group work on, what is the approach that it takes in integrating sustainable practices into the built environment to ensure harmony within the natural landscape and biodiversity conservation across UAE?
Thanks, Lana. First of all, thank you, and thanks to the EGBC for hosting this panel and inviting me to speak today. Unfortunately, I don't have pretty pictures as my colleague Mohammed was sharing, but I'll try to compensate for that. At Abu Dhabi Ports, as a developer, our remit covers both marine and the terrestrial environment. Our environmental footprint falls during both the construction and the operation of our assets. And that remit covers not just ports, but also covers community marinas and the large industrial terrestrial land bank, which is essentially our industrial zones and our free zones. Now, the regions we operate in are rich with biodiversity, and with that said, we do have a mandate to protect the environment as we grow the business. Now, from a company perspective, we do have a robust ESG framework and a strategy which is currently undergoing an update, given the ever so changing regional and international commitments that we're surrounded with. And these practices should be and will be shared through effective reporting and communication. Now, the topic that is constantly changing, this topic that is constantly changing, whether it's technology or international commitments, we have to be ready with that. And that's something that we take very seriously. Abu Dhabi in general, being more specific to the local environment, is home to around over 300 species, whether they're birds, plants, terrestrial, marine species, reptiles, and so forth. And roughly 70, if not more, of these species are under threat. And that's according to the Abu Dhabi Red List species report that was issued by the Environment Agency of Abu Dhabi. With that said, that gives us that responsibility to adhere to the local environmental standards, legislations, and norms, whether it's by the Ministry of Climate Change or the Environment Agency, covering not just biodiversity, but air, water, soil, and other ecosystems. Now, for some of our projects, and that's something that we've come across recently, is looking at projects not just locally but internationally as we expand our footprint. And the mandate expands beyond local requirements. And what does that mean? It means that we've started looking into ways to finance our projects through international lenders. That means that we have more stringent requirements, whether it's World Bank or IFC standards. And the thing about these standards, they have a heavy focus on biodiversity, whether it's a performance standards or whatnot. And that is directly linked to financing. So from an investment point of view, that reshapes the way our approach to development is, where environmental considerations are wedged into financing options. So it's not a nice thing to have anymore. It's something that's directly linked to the way we finance our projects. Another topic is our sustainability design guidelines, and that's another approach in which we integrate sustainable practices into the built environment. We've developed these guidelines to sort of guide the design of our projects, touching on 5 categories, which is water, energy, material selection, waste, and biodiversity. What is the topic of biodiversity when it comes to sustainable design? It covers ways in which we can work with nature. So that looks at rehabilitating, looks at enhancing natural systems in and around the project as we develop. So it looks at ways in which we can look at contaminated sites. Let's try and rehabilitate it, or we avoid removing protected or critical habitats within the project. And the other angle to it is looking at biodiversity hand in hand with the built environment. So looking at ways in which we can design buildings and infrastructure responding to the natural biodiversity. So we look at ways in which ecological engineering methods are in place when designing projects. So these are looking at nature-based solutions or nature-inspired solutions that are not just environmentally friendly, but are also economically cost-effective. Examples include utilizing or managing wastewater through nature-based solutions, so containerized sewage treatment plants that aims to treat and reuse water for our irrigation. Looking at ways in which we can incorporate native adaptive species, not just from a landscaping perspective, but also to reduce solar heat gain across certain areas. Looking at green roofs or green walls, which minimizes the impact of high temperatures. And finally, always looking at ways in which innovation and R&D is integrated or integrates eco-solutions into the built environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Youssef. It's really interesting that there's a holistic approach, and I'm sure many of the mega projects and even smaller projects in the UAE due to regulations, but at the same time, the way we're advancing towards sustainability of the built environment will eventually help create that balance between biodiversity, the built environment, and the natural environment. Tariq, thank you for joining again. Sorry it got cut off, but hopefully you can continue your point of view soon when your second question comes up. So
thank you, and sorry for this mistake.
It's fine. It's fine. So from setting the scene and then hearing a little about how things are done, moving on to more on challenges, but at the same time, opportunities and innovation that lies within. It takes us back to Peter. And so I don't want to mention the 4 decades, because so I don't want to say, these numbers, but from a lot of experience that you have in environmental activism and policy making, what trends have you observed when it comes to response to environmental challenges, particularly in the regions of Middle East, but also drawing from your experience in Canada? And what are the typical approaches or strategies that governments, NGOs, the private sector have taken to address these challenges related to biodiversity?
Great, thanks, Lena. Yeah, it was actually fun to look back over the 40 years or so that I've been involved in this industry or this challenge. And the trends that I've noticed are several. One, I think it started in the 1970s, that there was people started to wake up that there's something going on, that we don't have a very good relationship to the environment. We're starting to see some decline. So we saw a recognition of the need for global cooperation starting in the 1970s. For example, Greenpeace started in 1971. The Ramsar Convention for the Protection of Wetlands of International Importance was signed, I think, in the same year. It didn't come into force until a few years later. But there was a recognition that we needed to start working together, because these issues that we were noticing locally were also of global implication as well. So we started to see a little bit more of this. There was an increase in public awareness and education as well that I've seen, but never, in my view and experience, has the public interest and awareness and education with respect to environment been able to keep pace, even close to consumerism marketing. And this is one of the challenges that I think we continue to face until people are more focused and interested, or at least on an equal basis, to environment with, let's say, consumerism, marketing, going to the store, buying things. We're going to be faced with this challenge. Greater scientific research. There certainly has been a lot more research done on environment since the 1970s, and we've seen a lot more international cooperation in this regard. You can look at the International Panel for Climate Change, for example, which is the scientific basis behind our climate change agreements, setting up targets, the IPCC. So there's a lot of resources put into that now, unlike before. So there's an increasing trend in this regard. I've also noted there's more command and control, KPI-driven approaches. For example, ISOs, International Standard Organization. In 2015 alone, I think they published over 21,000 related documents for standards or support documents in this regard. So there's been an increase in this too. More private sector engagement. So we see CSR, corporate social responsibility initiatives, some of that driven by the government saying that you must have this, others doing it voluntarily. ESGs, environment social governance mechanisms, are being used more. The challenge I see with ESGs is it's still on the periphery. It's not an integral part of the decision-making process. It's something that's factored into it at some point, but in my view, I'm hoping the trend moves towards where ESG is with E, in other words, economic and development, that they work hand in hand from the beginning. And this is the trend I hope that happens. Another one is institutional changes. So for example, just this year, Dubai announced the establishment of an environment authority. So the department that I currently work in, the Environment Sustainability Department, which is part of one of 4 agencies within Dubai municipality. There's also 2 major sectors. So we're a little bit, I don't want to say buried, but we will then become a distinct authority. So this is an important institutional change. And also many federal ministries, for example, here in Oman, established, incorporated the word climate change into their mandate and into their titles. So these are the kind of things that I've seen over the years. What are the typical approaches or strategies that governments, NGOs, private sector employ? With respect to climate change, there's 2 ways to approach this really. Mitigation, in other words, emit less, absorb, recover, and store more carbon dioxide or carbon equivalent gases through energy efficiency, resource conservation, carbon sequestration, and that can be done naturally or with materials. So naturally, like mangroves, for example, are a common technique that's used here because they're very efficient at absorbing CO2. There's also ophiolite, which is a mineral that occurs both in the UAE, but more so in Oman, which if you inject liquid carbon dioxide into this material, it actually converts permanently into calcium carbonate. So you permanently remove the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere or from getting back into the atmosphere. So there are these sort of technologies that are potentially available that have been known for a while.
The
ophiolite.
Could you, sorry, repeat the name of?
Ophiolite. It's a type of mineral.
Okay. I got it. Interesting.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. No. There's some techniques that have been known for a long time. Actually, it's just a question of lining up the policy, the resources, the technology to actually make it happen. Adaptation, of course, is the other way, and you can adapt. In other words, accept climate change as inevitable, and build in resiliency to the changes that are being forecast. And nature-based solutions are definitely one way to go. For example, for these recent floods, if there had been more, let's say, green infrastructure throughout the city, you would have more absorbent surfaces instead of it running across the top. It would actually have infiltrated. It would have slowed down the movement of the waters. And so we may have had less impact if we had more green spaces appropriately designed and structured into the environment, including on the buildings themselves. So if you have green roofs, if you have vertical walls that include green, this all absorbs and reduces the flow of the waters. So you don't have those kind of flash floods in the city itself. So other responses, you have policy responses. Climate change is emphasized much more in decision-making and planning now. Regulatory, I was involved. I was the lead actually for regulating the 6 greenhouse gases in Canada, and this is back in 2006. So this enabled us to be able to use the tools under the legislation in Canada to start to manage the major large-scale emitters of greenhouse gases in Canada. So the regulatory approach is something that we're seeing more and more of. International agreements for sure, and conventions, some of them I've already mentioned. That's an important trend here, and they're including much more in terms of climate change. The Kyoto Accord, 1997, 2005, the Paris Agreement in 2015, Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. They're not perfect, but at least it's having a dialogue using the same kind of language. And this has been an important event The last thing, I think it'll be the last thing I'll mention are COPs, the Conference of the Parties. So on Ramsar, which is to protect wetlands of international importance, they meet every 3 years. The Convention on Biological Diversity, they meet, the parties do every 2 years. But for climate change, it's annual, every year. And this underscores the urgency and the need for action and decisions with respect to that. Already land use planning has been mentioned. The Dubai 2040 master plan actually has some really nice elements for it, increasing and doubling the amount of green space and protected areas within the Emirate of Dubai and in the city itself. And this would be really important for biodiversity, for climate change, and many of the issues that we face now, the loss of connection with nature, which was mentioned earlier as well. I think this is vital. I've experienced personally with family members that were struggling just in the last year massively with anxiety and panic attacks. And we went into nature and they went almost within minutes. They went from an extremely anxious state into joyful, happy, relaxed, calm. It's amazing how healing nature is if we just give it a chance. So I think many of the issues that we face today will start to take care of themselves if we just simply embrace nature more. Last thing I'll mention, I think the green building systems that are throughout the world. This is also an important way to go. And there's a couple that I became familiar with since I've been here with Dubai Municipality. One of them is called the International Future Living Institute. They're based out of Portland, Oregon in the USA. And I really like how they emphasize a lot about green building and urban planning with nature. So they actually work very carefully to try and incorporate both. And their green building philosophy is not one where they reduce say energy consumption or they reduce emissions of contaminants, but they actually have a net positive effect. And this is an important target that I think that they have. Biophilic Institute, also out of the US, I think it's in the University of Virginia it started. And this is one that recognizes and tries to use the science behind people being healthier and happier in green environments. We don't have a biophilic city officially declared in the Middle East, as far as I know. I proposed this a while ago. I think Dubai could be the first biophilic city in the Middle East. And I don't want to sort of make a competition out of it, but there's an opportunity there. Last thing, technologies, something that we often maybe we could use more as biotechnology. Again, this is using the enzymes that are produced naturally. So many of the issues that we face nowadays, pollution, odor, even energy consumption, they can be solved through biotechnology, and that technology already exists. So I hope that answers your question, Lana.
That answers more than what I've asked for, so which is amazing. And if I would take, I mean, one key takeaway is there's not actually one, I'd say, strategy. We can see the trends that are growing, but it's more of combining governmental efforts with awareness, with private sector, also advancement that will all kind of act together or work together harmoniously. So that takes us to Tariq. If you can also shed light on the challenges encountered in your conservation efforts, particularly concerning the link between urban development. I see one question on birds and how they would be impacted by building facades. So if we can shed light onto that, and what strategies have you found effective in overcoming these obstacles?
Okay, thank you very much. As I mentioned before, Jordan is a small country, so the need for development and urban development is high in Jordan, and this is the main challenges in our conservation in Jordan. So I will give you example about this issue. The Rift Valley, or Jordan Rift Valley, has high ecological importance on the national and international levels. It is the home of hundreds of species and the home of many communities who are living in the small town and villages with population over 200,000 people. Jordan Rift Valley has many tourism attraction site with culture and historical value. It has most productive agricultural lands in Jordan, Ghor, named by Ghor. Therefore, it is attracting many infrastructure projects, tourism development, land conservation activities. Jordan Rift Valley is strategically important for Jordan economic development, for energy in different sectors, including energy, hunting, tourism, waste management, and also agriculture, as well as for biodiversity conservation. So we are talking about the conservation outside of a protected area. And there is many areas important for conservation outside of a protected area. This different sectors have generated many of environmental problems of the Rift Valley due to imbalance and consumption of natural resources and land management. This has resulted in drastic land change in the Rift Valley, causing threats that would affect the biodiversity value, if not the integrity of their biodiversity and ecosystem. So RSCN has developed a new strategic objective to mainstream ecosystem approach in land use planning and at national and regional and local levels. RSCN worked with Ministry of Local Administration to address the land use planning, and during the last 7 years, we addressed as a major priority measure, since threats to conservation often lie outside the protected areas, unless the linkages between protected areas management and external factor. Therefore, RSCN believe that land use planning framework is a major opportunity for mainstreaming nature conservation in all protective sector, and can play a critical role in this regard at local and national level. Through this approach, RSCN has undertaken a comprehensive review of important bird area in Jordan along the Rift Valley in specific, and produced a detailed report about the conservation status of migratory soaring bird IBA's area and KBA's area under KBS, Key Biodiversity Area, botanic site, and other special conservation area. And the main objective, as mentioned for this activity, is to integrate IBA and KBAs into the land use planning process at the national level, and to provide a legal platform for land control and mitigation actions to ensure that safety of migratory soaring bird and their habitat. So RSCN submitted KBA's layer formally for Ministry of Environment to be incorporated within the national land use plans with associated regulation by law and sensitivity map. Ministry of Environment approved endorsement of KBA's map in the national regulation, and we delineated high-risk zones, including reserves, KBAs under national land use layer, and this layer incorporated within national land use plan under Ministry of Local Administration within the National Land Use and Development Master Plan. And also, RSCN developed a national land use guideline that to minimize the impact of development in these KBAs or key biodiversity areas. This will enhance its consideration as a priority in the planning and development process, applying urban growth management techniques like urban growth boundaries, controlling urban sprawl, and promoting ideas like growing inward and not at expense of natural heritage and agricultural land. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tariq. And honestly, it's interesting that you mentioned the protection of areas outside the preserved zones, because often, yes, the preserved zones hopefully are doing good, thriving, animals are protected, so are the plants. But then what happens outside, and what if the species, inside venture to the outside? So that's a whole different equation to talk about. This takes us to Alicia. If you can please tell us more about the interplay between water conservation as a water management expert. So share with us the water conservation efforts and the preservation of sensitive biodiversity in regions where urbanization pose significant challenge to both water resources and ecological balance.
So often I think we all need to just understand that everybody needs water. Everything on this planet needs water. And I think that does end up being the challenge is how can we make sure there's enough water and it's of good enough quality for everyone? We know that the urban environment does bring challenges to water quality. It reduces the water quality. So from the runoff alone, for example, all the stormwater runoff that's come over the last month is of high quality that's not suitable for the environment, and it's impacted some of that environment as well. When you have a lot of that runoff coming from the roads, for example, and that goes into the natural environment, it can end up contaminating soil and potentially infiltrating into the aquifers as well. So integrated planning is something that would be the first point of action of how can we ensure that water management on all levels, the water flowing through the natural environment, the water flowing from the urban environments and going to the built environments. And I think that this urban planning approach has to also address, okay, how we're going to grow our cities, where they're going to be, how can we have multiple benefits. I think some of them, are being echoed amongst the panel today, and that is because there is a theme and then there's a trend that nature is also there to sort of supplement what we can't do or to support us in what we can't do for water management. So green infrastructure is also something, and I know it's mentioned earlier, is something it's really important for us to integrate into our planning. So this includes water efficient infrastructure, like I've mentioned, those green spaces. So multiple spaces can have multiple benefits. I don't think we should limit ourselves to this area just being functional for one need. It's about having an area that can be functional for many different purposes. And biodiversity and water management are closely correlated, obviously, because we know that species and the biodiversity depend on good water quality, surface water, one of them being, which we don't have here. However, we have the opportunity to have landscapes that can promote that and landscapes that can also contribute to good water quality. So sustainable drainage management systems, I know that we spoke of that earlier, and these topics keep pulling through, but that's because they're of importance. And whether you're specializing in avian fauna, whether you're an urban developer or you're doing roads and transport, it's about that, again, back to that holistic approach and how everybody has that part to play when it comes to, because all of our sectors need water, so we'll all need to be responsible in how we're managing it, how we're treating it, how we're collecting it. We all have this responsibility because we're in a position where we compete for water. However, we should all be good water stewards because it is a resource that's limited, but it's a resource that we all solely depend on. So I think definitely the challenges would be how can we better manage and ensure that our water quality is maintained to a level that's fit for the environment, because if our biodiversity doesn't have what it needs, then that poses that's a risk to that as well. So also habitat preservation. We know that the mangroves and the wetlands and the coastal ecosystems are essential for this biodiversity. So our habits will directly, be reflected in that natural environment. So habitat preservation is also a really important thing that we must be considerate of, and we must ensure that we plan and integrate for. So that way we're having good water management as well as naturally conservation efforts of protecting biodiversity.
Thank you, Alicia. And we really should be more prepared for if there is a lot of rain coming. Really very significant and precious, but having it go through so many layers of the urban development and then end up contaminating our biodiverse areas of plants or whatever is something that is quite, I don't want to say sad, but it's important to tackle, let's say. So this takes us to Mohammed Asfour. So let's talk about innovation, solutions. What have you observed? And I wish if we can see more pictures later, but I know we're not prepared for that, but maybe you can share with us some other day. So what do you think? How's it going for that?
Hopefully, and I think this is a tough question. If you allow me, maybe I can start by sharing an example from a UN Habitat initiative I recently worked on. So as part of this project, the Greater Amman municipality provided the Queen Rania Park in East Amman as a location for a project that focused on urban farming, nature-based solutions, and food security. We worked with 33 local community members, including refugees, to introduce these concepts and more, whereby they learned about these issues and started applying ideas within these fields in their daily lives. What is important to mention here is that some of them started thinking of starting micro businesses based on the knowledge they had acquired. On a more strategic level, I believe that incorporating these concepts into urban planning can create opportunities for entrepreneurs, especially from an urban green infrastructure lens. Now, the application of these concepts opens many doors for entrepreneurs to innovate and come up with solutions that are applicable. However, creating the marketplace for such solutions cannot happen without ensuring high levels of public engagement in the process, which is something I emphasize on personally when I was part of the Urban Development Committee that contributed to a royal initiative that came up with an economic modernization vision for the country. A few years ago, I also did some work for the EBRD on public engagement. Now, the EBRD came up with something called GCAP, which is a Green Action Plan for Amman, but they realized that without involving citizens, the investments might not go in the desired direction. And when we use the word engagement, it means that we are establishing a subject-subject relationship where citizens feel that their opinions contribute to the process. And when they feel that, they can become part of it and probably help in creating this marketplace where they get involved in setting up their ventures and solutions and so on. That's it.
Thank you, Mohammed. So that takes us to Yusuf, last but not least. Sorry to keep you waiting. If you can also share some case studies or examples where AD ports encountered, for example, a challenge and then came up with a solution, where was innovation involved or technology that led to that integration of biodiversity within the built environment, please?
Yes, of course. As a developer, we develop and expand our footprint, and that's been happening very rapidly lately. And it's more than likely to impact the environment, and that's the challenge. Obviously, the first step in designing and planning is trying to avoid these impacts of the environment. But to be realistic, we will reach a point in which, instead of avoiding, we need to adapt with this ever so growing industry that we're in, try to mitigate, and I think the last resort is compensate, because at the end of the day, the balance between environmental sustainability and economic development is tricky. The right balance needs to be aimed for. At the end of the day, we must adapt and find solutions to minimize impacts on local biodiversity, but also contribute to its growth. One of the examples, I have a few examples that I'll be sharing today, is when we're master planning, and that's just the first step when designing, whether it's cities or industrial zones. And in my point of view, or our case in Abu Dhabi ports, we conduct environmental impact assessments for many of the areas that we operate in, and one of them is Kizad, and Kizad being the industrial zone or economic zone of Abu Dhabi. Size-wise, it's roughly around 500 kilometer squares of a land bank, which is massive. And during the environmental impact assessment, the findings or the outcomes, we came across threatened or vulnerable species, which is spiny tail lizards, and that's according to the IUCN, or the International Union for Conservation of Nature. They're classified as vulnerable, and it's an exercise that we conducted with the Environment Agency of Abu Dhabi, where trying to understand these species more, because there was a gap in data, and at the same time trying to find ways in which we can grow as a business, but at the same time find the best habitat for these species that will be relocated. And what we did is we managed to track these species. We managed to gather data and understand their behavior and their ecology. We tracked them for over a year now. And hopefully in the next month or so, we'll be relocating them to a newly developed area, which is called KZAD Conservation Area. And that will be an area or a protected area for species that might be impacted by the development footprint. We'll be monitoring them for another year to try and see, you know, their growth within this new protected area. And the plan is to produce a best practice guideline for spiny tail lizards. And that goes beyond our mandate as just a developer. We try to see ways in which we can grow with nature and try to promote nature that might have been displaced by footprint. That's from a terrestrial point of view. Now, from a marine perspective, and most of our business occupying the marine environment, it goes without saying that the construction or the impact from developing ports or marinas could be quite detrimental to some habitats, and that comes from the dredging and reclamation activities that happens when we construct new developments in the marine environment. And one exercise that we worked closely in developing is finding ways in which we can compensate for the lost habitats such as seagrass in the seabed of some of these areas that we've worked on. So we managed to develop ecological mattresses. We've actually deployed 17 of those that are roughly around 300 square meters and installed them on the seabed, which aims to mimic the natural environment. So it sort of attracts the growth of marine flora and fauna, reduces the influence of invasive species that happen to come into these marinas from ships that, you know, dock from international waters, and essentially offsets any impacts from the marina development which have happened while developing these marinas or ports. We've monitored these ecological matrices for, I think, several months now. And what was interesting is that we've seen growth on the marinas. We've seen more than 15 new species of algae, 13 species of fish, many species of invertebrates. That was quite unique, and seeing how innovation can be implemented in areas where biodiversity has been impacted and try to revitalize the growth in some of these community marinas. Another flagship project that we're very proud of is the coral relocation exercise, which included the relocation of over 500 corals from the northern revetment, which is the eastern breakwater of Khalifa Port. So from the northern revetment, to the eastern breakwater of Khalifa Port, which is close to the Ras Ghanada reef, which is, if I'm not mistaken, one of the largest coral reefs in the Arabian Gulf. That was a collaborative exercise we conducted with NYU Abu Dhabi, the Environment Agency, and our consultants GHD, which essentially was a research exercise, but it stemmed out of the impact that the development or the expansion of Khalifa Port would have had on that coral ecosystem. We've relocated them, completed the relocation 3 years ago, and for the past 3 years we've been monitoring them. And we should be issuing a best practice guide on the results out of that relocation exercise. And lastly, one of the most recent ventures we've conducted was a collaboration with ADQ and Archireef, which is a nature tech company. We deployed vertical ecological seawall panels at 2 locations, one in Saadiyat and one in Al Alia, which again was sort of a compensation to revitalize the marine ecosystem in both those marinas as we develop those ferry terminals and community marinas. And it sort of acts as a mimic to the natural environment. So it attracts marine biodiversity across different tidal ranges on the quay walls. So these panels were installed on the quay walls of the marinas and sort of acts as a refuge to certain species to protect them from sunlight, or provide moisture retention, or protect them from bigger species that are around that area. And it's essentially made from nature-based materials. So these panels are made from oyster shell, powders, glass, sand, and it's sort of bringing all the elements of circular economy to the production of these panels. Yeah, I think that's essentially what it is. And I mean, the key message is many of these methods of integrating biodiversity into the development or to urban areas stems from R&D, stems from innovation, which is quite exciting, and finding unique proposals or unique ideas for the growth of biodiversity in these areas.
Thank you, Yusuf. Alicia, I saw you nodding. sounds or music to your ears related to water and biodiversity. And it's so interesting to know that, a tiny species, I don't know what's the size of it, but it could kind of pause a development, lead to research, lead to collaboration or projects. We have around 5 minutes left. If any of our attendees want to ask any question in the meeting chat. Meanwhile, any last words, if you have any advice for organizations or individuals on how to collaborate, move this topic further, please feel free to share. I open the floor for any of you.
Well, if I could start, I really enjoyed the conversation. I really enjoyed what I was hearing. For example, ecological matrices, I've never heard that term before, but I'm really curious about them. There's a lot of interest in this part of the world for trying to do something to protect the marine environment. So that and the vertical seawall panels, very interesting for me. So I would love to see some sort of follow-up technical meeting, maybe even face-to-face, where we have longer presentations. This has been a really nice introduction, but the notion and the opportunity to share ideas in more depth, I think, would be really, really interesting for everybody.
Sure. I see, Mohammed, you have your hand raised, so go ahead.
Yes. Now, it's always nice to look at things from a business perspective and about creating the marketplace and so on. But unless we are really passionate about what we're doing, we cannot achieve much. So I think when it comes to biodiversity, we really need to believe in the cause, and then everything else follows.
Thank you, Yusuf. And if I may just interfere, and I don't know if Peter, you can later, after Yusuf mentions what he wants to say, tap into what the attendee mentions as National Biodiversity Index, that there's one for Abu Dhabi, but what about Dubai as well as other Emirates? So we'll start off with Yusuf, and maybe Peter, if you can elaborate on that.
Thanks, Lana. Maybe just to add on what Peter mentioned earlier, I'd be more than welcome. The invitation not just extends to you, but to everyone on this call. The ecological or in vertical seawall panels are installed in Saadiyat Marina. It's a public marina that's open to the community for anyone to just pass by and have a look at the panels that are accessible to the public. So always reach out to me. And I mean, key message again, just to reiterate, it's many of these initiatives that I mentioned earlier were not done alone. We do not have all the solutions that work. We're very proud of our achievements, but we're also proud of the lessons learned on that journey. We're proud of things that didn't work as well, but sort of open the conversation and engagement with key partners to understand what has been tried in the region, what has actually met or surpassed expectations. So we always welcome opportunities to collaborate here in Abu Dhabi ports, to share knowledge, or even just to bounce ideas in a conversation. So yeah, thanks again. Back to you, Lana.
So Peter, do you have any idea on Dubai Biodiversity Index? I don't want to put you under the spotlight, but
That's okay. I can just say I have no idea. Actually, no, I do have a little bit of an idea. It's not my role to do that, but we have others in the office that are involved. It's a national initiative, as I understand it. Each emirate contributes towards this index, and so we have one of our biologists right now, I think over the last couple of weeks, has been out doing surveys just to update the status of our biodiversity. So we do this, we participate. We would love to have more resources to be able to do this in a more regular way, but we do participate. I just wanted to comment on what Mohammed had mentioned about the passion. And I think one of the key challenges that we face is not the passion amongst the people that are sitting here, but amongst the decision makers, the ones that have to wear those CEO hats. Those are the ones that we need to engage in such a way that they feel also this desire to protect and conserve nature. So we have to somehow be able to get them to wear multiple hats, one of them being the ones that we wear most of the time.
Thank you. Thank you. And that kind of wraps up our session for today. Thank you so much to Jordan Green Building Council and to our speakers from Jordan. Thank you so much to our speakers from the UAE, and we look forward to collaborating further with you. And I hope you connect beyond this session to, you never know what magic can come out of this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Actually,
Thank you, Lana,
end of day.
and Emirates GBC. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.